What is our military for? That's what we're going to be talking about today, right, James?
I can't wait. I think people are going to have lots of different opinions about this, but we're going to explore it a little bit from different angles, inside, outside. And I'll let you start since you've got a bit more experience in this than I do.
Well, I mean, I think our military is unique in some ways because a lot of militaries in other countries, especially if you're talking about like Africa and South America, which I'm familiar with, their militaries are used domestically. They're used for internal security in a lot of times. And our military is specifically for external. We have all kinds of other agencies for our internal security and border security, but there's not in a long time has our military been involved in things within the United States. So I think that's a big difference that a lot of people don't appreciate. I think internationally, why is your military so big? To defend your country. Well, we don't defend our country physically with our military, but we try to use it as a countermeasure to make sure that other countries don't get into a situation or a kind of a situation where they would invade us, I guess is the right way to present it.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about it, Randy, I would say we do use our military to defend the United States, but all of the action that the military undertakes is outside of the US right now. We say we're going to be exposed to risks if this situation in the Middle East develops in a way that we don't like. So that's that rationale I've heard publicly expressed many times, which is the purpose of the military is to protect the United States. That is the same function. It's just that we're operating outside of the United States.
I mean, I think there's actually got to be some congressional loopholes done for the military to actually to work in the United States. National Guard excluded. National Guard falls under, the president can like he did during January 6th, the president can call for the National Guard's aid and things like that. But as far as the actual military functioning, like there's been cases where the military we wanted to help do something within the United States and we weren't authorized. And I think some exceptions like 9/11, when the Air Force was like, I think they're called on to defend the Capitol and things like that. You have in the military even do disaster relief. You have a battalion that with the manpower to go and put sandbags, but they don't call upon us to do that. They call the National Guard, they call for volunteers and things like that, just because it's not our mandate, their mandate. I'm not part of them anymore.
So is the US so different than all of the rest of the world that we are the only country that needs to have a military big enough to basically take on the entire world? What makes us special that we're different than China or Japan or Iran or anybody for that matter, that we think, well, a danger could arise anywhere and we have to be able to protect ourselves from that danger anywhere? Is it just that the other countries aren't big enough, that nobody cares about them, they can't afford it? What do you suppose? I mean, I accept your proposition that we're unique, but why? Is it just because we can? Or are we uniquely annoying to people that they want to potentially harm us?
I mean, I don't know how far back it goes, but kind of, I think it was it Kennedy that said we will go anywhere to defend democracy. When we took up that as our motto, I think there's some expectations set up by that statement.
Do you think that is what the military is credibly doing, defending democracy as such? Or is it always and defending democracy and there's a US interest that goes, people will say, Randy, that we were in the Middle East because we were defending our oil interests, or people will say we're in Ukraine now, not to defend democracy, but to degrade Russia's capabilities. And it's a really great way for us to get rid of a whole bunch of armaments and to test things out in practice and not use our own civilian population as the guinea pigs. So I would say, there's the idealistic Kennedy brings right to mind. And then there's the cynical, which is, that's not enough, and it never was enough.
I mean, I think that we would be, I mean, the US government would, if they're not serving the US, the country, the United States interests in the, because there's definitely a lot of democracy helping to go around in the world, right? And that we don't step in the middle of. And I think every nation has an internal responsibility to the people to look out for their interests, economical and a variety of, other thoughts behind it, because you're paying taxes to your government to make sure that your country, your specific country, is prosperous. However, there's a lot of misunderstanding. For instance, Afghanistan. Did we go into Afghanistan just to take out Al Qaeda, and then by proxy we took out the Taliban because the Taliban were in charge of the country and wouldn't let us get access to Al Qaeda? That's what we said we did. Then we stayed there. Why? Because if we hadn't, probably the Taliban would have, taken it over really quickly, and because there wasn't an established government or military or anything, and they ended up doing that anyway. And then the Al Qaeda would have came back, or other terrorist organizations. So that was what we said we were doing. But after we'd been there for 5, 6, 7 years, I was in Colombia. I was stationed in Colombia for 4 years. And I remember I had some college students, like 100 college students that were translating we have these hospital ships that twice a year on different sides of the world. One goes in Asia, one goes to South America, and they practice humanitarian effort for disaster relief, but in doing so, they actually do humanitarian effort for countries in South America. That's my experience, right? So they go all along the coast, either along the Pacific coast or in the Caribbean, and they arrange to stop in a variety of different countries and give. They have 100 doctors, a bunch of engineers. They build schools for these communities. They set up a little clinics and see the local people and things like that, and give free medication, exams, and some do surgeries on the ship and things like that for the people. And when we're doing that, we're practicing for a disaster relief in the United States. Like if we need the ships there, or disaster relief anywhere in the world, if we need to send our ships there, we've already got the process for security, for the ship people, for the doctors and everything. We've already done all this stuff in a peacetime, non-disaster, non-stress. We're a lot able to do it better. So I had a point behind this and I lost it when I was talking about that hospital ship. What was I talking about, James?
I think it was the time that we were in Afghanistan. It started a certain
Yeah,
way, and then it extended for years and years, and then
Yeah. So I was with these translators for the ship. This is just another thing our military does. So I guess that's pertinent to this conversation, the hospital ships. But I was with these translators that we had hired translators to come translate for the doctors. And in our free time, they're like, hey, Randy, I got a question for you. I was like, yeah, what's up? And they're like, why are you stealing all of Afghan's oil? And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, you're in Afghanistan right now, stealing their oil. Why'd you invade that country? I was like, first of all, Afghanistan's not really known for its oil. I'm not sure it has any oil at all that I'm aware of. And we went in there because the people that attacked us were based out of there, and the authorities of that country, which weren't a democracy at the time, said, we're not going to help you. And so we said, if you're not going to help us, we're going to go in and get them, and we might oust you in the process. And that's what we did. And then we were stuck with a country with no government. And so we stayed there to help them kind of set up their government. And that's why we're there. And that's really why I believe we were there at that time. And I'm not sure it changed a whole lot. I think near the end, we were just trying to figure out how can we, after 20 years, how do we get out of it? But the question was, there's people around the world that say, hey, you're only in there for your own interest. Yeah, we went in there for our own interest, but we stayed. I'm not sure we stayed for anyone but Afghans' interest. Now there was a lot of money and, put in from different businesses that, open businesses down there. There's the big security business, the big military, support, all the support to the military down there, that there's a lot of companies that made a lot of money. Don't get me wrong. And that was probably good for the American economy in some ways. But I don't think initially that was what we were doing.
All right. So there's a couple things in what you just said that are worth explaining and digging into. First is just a simple acceptance that for big decisions, there are likely going to be multiple reasons. Even if you have one primary reason, it's not going to be only one thing. And that's the way the world is, right? For significant decisions, there's always going to be multiple interests and sometimes competing interests. I think we have to be adult about this and say it's okay. It's okay for the United States to act sometimes with multiple motives. And by the way, for those interests to shift as time goes on and you see what happens. Things get muddled sometimes because maybe everyone's grasp of geography isn't great. We went into Kuwait to stop Saddam Hussein from clearly invading a sovereign country. But why'd we pick that one? Well, they did have oil that we cared about, right? So that one you could say, all right, you were defending your own economic interests. Yes. And we were also defending democracy. Yes. And we were also defending against the unjust war of aggression. Yes. And it doesn't necessarily matter if you say any one or multiple of those objectives would have been sufficient. So what I want to say with that is you might have a primary objective and then subsidiary objectives, and then they might shift over time, depending upon how long the engagement takes you. That's okay. War and military engagement is always going to have that sort of complexity associated with it. The other things that you said specific to Afghanistan that I find interesting and come to this question of what sort of military does a country need to have, and specifically what sort of military does the United States need to have is, all right, we accomplished objective one, got the Al-Qaeda, and in so doing, ousted the existing government. Well, now what? Do we leave chaos behind, or do we help them establish a new government? And here we see probably one of the most difficult aspects of the military's multiple missions. If your objective is to defeat a foe, we do pretty good at that. If your objective is to instill democracy, well, that's not something the military can do at all. And not because we don't try really hard and do really good things. The fact is, there's a lot of conditions necessary for the development of democracy. And the fact that we were in Afghanistan for 20 years and the government collapsed within 15 minutes of us leaving suggests that it is not an easy endeavor, right? So then I think you could have a legitimate question of, are we appropriately using the military when we have a combination of objectives that don't necessarily go well together? Defeat an enemy, run a government, those are very different things. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference in mission for something that went on for so long. I think you were back and forth to Afghanistan over a number of years, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was like Wild Wild West the first couple of years. I was there in 2002, right after about 9 months after the initial invasion. And then I was there in 2003. And then I didn't get back there till 2007, 2008. And then the war changed a lot once you got into past 2010. I don't think anyone saw the military industrial complex when the first 5 years. We were just trying to figure out what we were going to do about it. And to tell you the truth, the military adapted pretty quickly, and we made special units that the one that comes to mind is the PRT that would come in force working with nonprofit. And they were like the kind of connectors to all the nonprofit and the military security and the Afghan. But basically it was a civil affairs kind of unit on steroids. I think some of their main missions was to work by, with, and through the Afghan local government and bring in charities that could address their problems, nonprofits that could address their problems, and then apply military units that could help too, because we have military engineer units that can, build bridges and fix roads, and they have a lot of capabilities as well. So kind of uniting all of those, and so we started these teams down there. And to tell you the truth, I don't know what they do now. I don't know if they disintegrated, they kind of someone else absorbed them or something like that. But in Afghanistan, they started appearing, as far as I remember, like 2006, 2007, and they became, I don't know the definition of power in this, but they became powerful in the fact that they had the ear of the Afghan government and they had the ear of the military, and they could make things happen in some ways. And so the army adapted to that. Was that the right? And then there's also been talk, while I was in the military, there was talk of like, hey, maybe there's room for two armies, just like we made Space Force, we make Civil Force or something like that. And their purpose is to country build, nation build.
I think what you're describing hints to me that there is, and this is also something that in any discussion of the military is useful to realize, the military is political. It's made up of people, and that has two consequences. It's run by people, politicians, as well as military leaders, and it's made up of people. And therefore, the longer an engagement goes, the more likely you're going to confront political questions, political issues. Do we as a country want to keep spending money, putting young soldiers in harm's way? And those are legitimate questions that get to the question of, well, what is the military for? The idea of creating multiple military forces or units that maybe have different functions strikes me as sensible, right? You have an Air Force and a Navy and an Army because they perform in different theaters or different types of skill sets. Why not also have one that recognizes there's the fighting piece and then there's the building piece, and those are as adaptable as the military is? And you're right, I saw that there was a lot of that going on, that people who were there originally for one purpose figured out how to do a very different thing. As adaptable as people are, maybe we should recognize that when we have an engagement with multiple objectives, using the same people to accomplish all of those objectives might not be the best way to do it. It also leads to muddled discussions. The reason we went there in the first place isn't the reason that we were there 5 years later or 10 years later. And the more openly you can discuss that and say, well, okay, now the objective is this. How do we best achieve that objective? The fact that the military is political ultimately, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I just mean that it's subject to humans making decisions about what's the best outcome, means, however, that it's also subject to bad decisions made for short-term political gain that can undo years and years of otherwise military success. How much does the political oversight, by oversight by the president and by elected officials, affect the military's ability to carry out its mission?
So, well, first of all, I just looked up Provincial Reconstruction Team is a PRQ. So if anyone cares to look that up, and it was an interesting job. I think they did some recruiting for it in the middle of the war and stuff like that. Civil affairs is kind of where that stemmed from. One way I want to present this is something that I experienced when I was studying for my MFA in creative writing. There's a lot of people that were very political in my class, and one of the courses I took was how do you write the ability to write to message for a purpose, to give a message. And the discussion was over shock and awe. If you remember when we attacked Iraq in 2003, there was this conversation about whether we should do shock and awe, which was air attack, artillery attack, just attack from all sides on Iraq to take out a lot of assets in Baghdad so that we could initiate our tank and infantry and the assault into Iraq. And we read a couple of articles and poems, and there was actually an ex-Marine who his biography said he went in the Marines because it was Marines or prison at the time. He was in the Marines during Vietnam, but he didn't go to Vietnam. He went to Okinawa, so he didn't actually serve in combat. And then during shock and awe, he created this website for everyone to write creatively against shock and awe, because it was he compared it to what was going to happen, what happened in Vietnam. We were going to bomb innocents and kill innocent people and things like that. And then after reading all his material, my peers in the group were like, this is the worst thing in the world. And they were writing anti, shock and awe things. And I said, the benefits of shock and awe, which no one's written about, is if we're going to decide to go to war against Iraq, we're going to bomb their anti-aircraft, their artillery, so that they can't take out our tanks, their anti-aircraft, so they can't take out our airplanes, their special operation units, so they'll lose morale, things like that. Their antennas, their communication centers, their command and control centers. Also, unlike Vietnam, which was, and people were talking about barrel bombing, which no one does barrel bombing. Barrel bombing is what we did in World War II. We did some in Vietnam where just bombs are rolling out the back of the plane. Everything's targeted now. We hit things on purpose. We may have bad intelligence. I'm not going to say we hit everything, we thought we were hitting. Sometimes we have bad intelligence and we hit the right building, but for the wrong reasons. But people who are talking about barrel bombing or not have no idea what they're talking about. So what I'm trying to get is there was a rising of public opinion, like we shouldn't do shock and awe. I'm like, well, what do you want us to do? The question isn't whether we should do shock and awe. If we're going to war, we need to do shock and awe, or we're going to lose hundreds and thousands of American soldiers. So the question isn't for you to decide if we should do shock and awe, because this is how you fight combat. And if you want to win, that's how you do it. The question is, should we go to war in Iraq, which is a political decision? And if you're not happy with that political decision, then you need to make that known to the politicians. You probably won't have time to vote the right people in, because those people are already making the decisions, but then you need to make it known, especially nowadays. It wasn't possible with social media back then, but now in social media, that's how you tell your politicians that you're not happy with their decision. But if you tell them how to fight the war, then you're going to see a lot of casualties that I don't think you want to see either. So does that make sense, James?
It does. I understand what you're saying, and I think it reflects something that we see in public debate a lot, not just with respect to the military, but any important topic. And that's what I'll refer to as unidimensional thinking. People who look at just one side of the issue and say, war is bad, we shouldn't have war. Well, yeah, okay, that's true. Or, they look at just the costs of a situation, shock and awe has some collateral damage, but not the benefits. And you're saying, well, actually, in this case, the benefits far outweigh the costs. And if you have a more nuanced and fuller discussion, then you'll see that if we've made the decision to go down this route, this is actually the least cost and most benefit way to do it. And for us and for the listeners of the Passionately Wrong podcast, it's one of our points that we'll keep coming back to. The way to make better decisions is to get more information. Don't focus too quickly in on any one thing, even if you're very clear about your objective. And before I was saying we need to be clear about the objectives when we're putting the military to use. You then have to go further and say, all right, let's say we've made the political decision we want to go in. And it is a political decision. You're right. Now, once we're there, we've got to have a full discussion and a fulsome discussion of costs, benefits, pros, cons, and not just focus on, well, it's bad if we kill civilians. We're going to take extraordinary steps to make sure we never kill civilians. Well, okay, if you do that, what if you've extended the duration of the war by 100% and you end up killing more soldiers than you would have killed civilians? There's never an answer that has only upsides. There's always upsides and downsides. There's always benefits and costs. And that's what I hear you saying, which is, to have a good discussion, to come to a good decision, you've got to be able to consider more sides than just the one that you started with. When you raised that point in your class, did it change anyone's mind, or?
So there's a couple points I raised in this thing. I was like, why are you listening to this guy? Well, he's a Marine. He knows what he's talking about. He's like a private. He got out. He went in as a prisoner into the military. He came out almost the same rank he left as. He doesn't know anything about preparing the battlefield. He doesn't know anything about artillery. He doesn't know anything. I don't even know I think he was a logistics guy. So he doesn't know anything about fighting a war. And yet he didn't even go to Vietnam. and yet he's got all these opinions. Okay, first of all, so you're listening to a guy who really has no experience in this, first of all. Second of all, if you conduct the war like we did, and we won Iraq in 100 hours, all right, then if we win the war in 100 hours, there's less civilian casualties after that 100 hours. So you do have this, as you say, collateral damage because it's war. And the question should always be, are we going to war or not? And if we're going to war, we should go to war to win. I mean, that makes the only sense to me. And the faster you win, the faster you can get, everything, repair stuff. And because we, funny enough, we're almost the only country in the world that after we invade a country, for lack of a better word, or attack a country, we end up spending a bunch of money, time, and effort to rebuild it better than we left it. And I'm sure there were some innocents that died in Baghdad because there were bombs that went off in Baghdad. They were targeted at specific buildings. Buildings fell, rocks fell on the ground, and I'm sure some innocents unfortunately died. But if we hadn't done that and our army had been stopped and the war had lasted for 6 months like Ukraine, 9 months like Ukraine, I can only imagine what that would have looked like as far as the cost of human life. So going back to your question, the checks and balance, the cost, the pros and cons, getting information from multiple sides. When I brought this to their attention, that was their excuse. Well, I didn't know. All I knew is what I read in this guy's report. And I was like, once again, why did you listen to this guy? Well, because he's in the military. I don't know anybody in the military. I was like, okay, so do you think everyone in the military knows how to fight a war? 90% of them probably don't. And, just the generals are fighting the war. So, and then I was like, but it didn't really change their opinion of what they wanted to do. They just became defensive. Well, I didn't know any better. So that's why I wrote it. And I was like, no one uses barrel bombs. Like, well, how am I supposed to know that? I was like, because you do some research.
This is a totally believable story. And we'll come back to it in the sense that part of making better decisions is about being able to more quickly and easily. We know thinking is hard, so we're trying to find ways to do it more effectively, quicker. But for sure, knowing who your source is and being able to assess their credibility, very important. Also, is the information you're getting itself credible? You're going to be making decisions about how to think about something, how to behave. Are you sure you've got good information, or have you just gone far enough to get an opinion? And then the third thing that you mentioned, which is people don't change their mind, they just get defensive when confronted with new information. It's so interesting, right? That is a human trait that a lot of us have, and I'm not criticizing anyone for it. It's just how we're wired. It's helpful sometimes to ask yourself, well, wait a minute, what am I getting so defensive about? Just because I held an opinion doesn't mean that's who I am. It's just at the moment, that's what I thought based on the information I had. Are you more interested in being right, or are you more interested in finding a good answer? And I think there are no perfect solutions when you're talking about military topics. And for many policy topics, there's just trade-offs. So what's the trade-offs that you are balancing out here?
There's a lot of emotion too when people talk about the military. They have really, really strong feelings both ways. And so these same individuals, we were reading Sinbad of all things, right? We read Sinbad in my MFA course, which is great because I love that story. And then when they were asked to comment on it, my peers would one of my peers most of them were high school teachers. And they were like, this is horrible. This sounds just like a recruiting story that the recruiters in my high school would send, telling them lies to get them to go to combat and die for nothing. And I'm like, this was in I think I was finishing this up in 2012, 2014 or something like that. I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, you don't understand, Randy. These people out there, they're lying to these young kids and, convince. And I was like, I mean, first of all, in Afghanistan, Americans, don't get me wrong, I don't think any American soldiers should be dying in Afghanistan, but 20 people are dying a year, this is in 2013, 2014, I was like, so we're not sending them to die for their country. You're probably more likely to die in a college fraternity prank than to die in war now, because there's not a lot of people dying in war. This isn't Afghanistan where we're losing thousands of people a year. So that's wrong. And then people are having problems paying for college, and the college benefits of joining the military are freaking incredible. And you learn a lot of things and things. So, I mean, I'm not sure I don't know what they're telling people, but recruiters don't traditionally lie. Maybe they don't say everything that the guy needs to know to make the right decision. Ideally they do, but everybody's situation is different. So I think it goes back to getting information and being passionately wrong and saying, I'm like, if you send him to combat, he might be safer than going to college, and this also expanded into, well, everyone's getting raped in the military. I was like, I mean, I could say everyone's getting raped in college, and I would be just as right, or maybe more right in some cases, so, maybe we've just proved it's safer to go in the army than to go to college, whatever you guys want to get out of that, but you've just made some assumptions and you really haven't done any research on this to be spouting all these things, in my opinion.
Probably a topic for a future episode is how quickly and how easily we all form opinions, how little it takes for us to start to have a feeling about something. You read an article in a magazine about, some incident that happened at a college or at military, and all of a sudden you come to these absolute statements that are exaggerated and not conducive to clear and critical thinking. So I've made a note. That's something I'd like to come back to. How do you form an opinion and how do you change your opinion? What are the conditions under which those things happen? Unfortunately, I think the dynamic is it's much easier to form an opinion than it is to change an opinion. Once an idea gets into our heads, it becomes part of how we think we are, and it's therefore much harder to change it. I don't know why that should be so, but that's a little bit at play here in what I hear you describing about people's attitudes to the military, at least in the discussions that you were having. Can I ask you a slightly different question to get at how we feel about the military differently, Randy? And that would be, are there any downsides you can think of to the US having such a large and well-funded military? We spend, I believe, the bill that's being discussed by Congress right now is to spend $850 billion, which is a lot. It's a lot for the US. We're the biggest country in the world, the biggest economy in the world. So it's okay that we might spend the most, but proportionally, we also spend more than other countries with big economies. And for some of them, we spend a lot more. And okay, we just talked about all the reasons why it might be necessary to have a military. But again, my question, is there any downside that you can think of to that approach?
I mean, I think, having been in the military for over 30 years, I think there's probably some fat you could skin off of it. And definitely, I realize it's a huge cost. However, and I guess the answer to your question is I don't know. Because when I've been involved in helping build some countries' military from the ground up, and when you talk to them about this, they try to concentrate on things that they're not ready for, or they don't have the groundwork set up. They're like I think I was working in a South American country. I won't say which one it is. They're like, we want a battleship. Well, a battleship doesn't just appear and is able to shoot stuff and, logistically move around. And I mean, first of all, what do you need a battleship for? You got just a little piece of beach. What are you protecting? But second of all, I mean, the battleship requires engineers to be trained, requires logistics personnel to be changed. It requires all these specialists that have to be trained somewhere, and you don't have the capabilities, you don't have this thing in your country to train them, right? And then depending on what battleship you want, we may not even be able to train them because we may not have that battleship in our inventory, So when you start cutting jobs in the military and like, do we need these guys? and then you make everyone else's job either harder or more dangerous because you've accidentally, taken out a someone that is part of the safety network as well, just because they were doing something that was really important and everyone kind of forgot about it. So it's a kind of a mixed bag, right? It depends on what ultimately it depends on what we want to do with our military, as we spoke about in the beginning. And then when we do, we really have to, there's very few people that understand every part of a capability that we have. And then by not going in there and taking your time to understand it completely, when you take it out, there's a hole that can't be filled immediately, or something else pops up on the horizon, not necessarily a war, but some kind of defensive thing, and now we don't have that capability. So
It reminds me of something I see in business sometimes, which is anything I don't understand is easy to do. And, your point is, look, it's not always easy to do. And particularly for the military, if you want certain capabilities, it requires a certain scale and scope that's unavoidable. You're either going to not do it well, or if you do it well, then you got to accept the full package that comes with it. Running a battleship requires not just the battleship, but a whole bunch more. That, though, does lead to the first point you mentioned, which is there's fat. And that is simply a consequence of the more money that gets thrown around, the more opportunity there is for there to be, the same percentage amount of waste or inefficiency is just going to seem like a much bigger opportunity cost when you're spending hundreds of billions of dollars rather than hundreds of dollars. So I think it's a little bit, again, the adult decision. Listen, guys, we want to have certain capabilities, and those capabilities come with certain costs. And it's not easy to, or not always realistic or appropriate to just pull away one little piece without realizing that it's going to have consequences on other pieces. I think that's what I hear you saying.
Yes. No, it's a really complicated question.
That's a consequence of having a large military, that it comes with certain costs and some frictions, and it's hard to do it in a way that doesn't create those costs. If you really want to have global spanning capabilities, yeah, you're going to be spending a ton of money. How about this? You've all had the circumstance of being at a dinner and there's somebody who's Mr. Daddy Warbucks. He's got the big credit card and he's on an expense account, and it might be a dinner with 30 people, all of whom would be capable of paying for their meal. But Daddy Warbucks pulls out his platinum card at the end and says, I got this. When the US military is so dominant, so large, so capable, a great thing for us, it could potentially have the tendency to have the other diners at the meal say, well, I guess Daddy Warbucks is taking care of it for us. I don't need to spend so much. That's been a common criticism that Americans have heard. Do you think there's any truth to it? Or am I being unfair and just repeating things that I've read about but have no firsthand experience of? You've interacted with lots of countries' militaries. They're probably doing their best given their resources. Are we fair to criticize them for letting the US foot the bill?
So, I'm not read into all this, though. I read into some that probably above the normal amount, given all my jobs. We do a bunch of different things. For instance, in Afghanistan, or for instance, we've had kind of a compilation of units in the Sinai to maintain peace there, and the Bolivian-Peruvian border, and all these things, right? And things all around the world where we have interest, and so does NATO and things like that. And we would, fund other nations to provide the security there, and we would provide the training for that, and then send them trained to do that. In the long run, that costs less than having our soldiers do it, because our soldiers make less money, and our soldiers make more money. Our soldiers have $100,000 worth of training per soldier, or whatever, depending on what their profession is and things like that. So we end up saving money, rather than if we don't send our own guys, if we think that's a legit thing to do. There's also a lot of confusion, or things that we refuse to take advantage of. And I'll give you an example. I was in Nigeria, and we had some military coming in, and we wanted the British to support us. And I was like, I was in the middle of this, and I was like, hey, I need to get a bill so that I can get it to our money guys so they can reimburse you. And the logistics sergeant made some calls and said, hey, don't worry about it. It's just 10 guys. Pretty much you've been funding the British people to go to Kuwait and Iraq. Our bases, you take care of us, you feed us and stuff. Not a big deal. We can cover 10 guys. And I was like, oh, that's great, cool. And then my money's guy's like, no, because you will incur a hypothetical debt with the British, and we don't want to owe anybody anything. We don't want them to say, remember we took care of those 10 guys in Nigeria? Well, I don't know what they were going to ask for that, but I was just like, I mean, I guess in a way it made sense, but it seems like we could come more to a like, hey, we took care of 5 million people in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, and we'll just take that off your debt that we don't expect you to get paid. But if you wanted to give us 10, we'll take 10 away from that 5 million or something like that. It seems like it'd be more, I'm sure there's a lot of evidence of that in especially European nations that we work with, where they try to provide something and we refuse to take it, and we end up have to use our tax money to pay for something like that, which sounds kind of ridiculous, as in we're all allies, we're all in the same direction, same purpose. And this probably happens a lot. I just never realized it. And it seems kind of silly if we're all gonna try to work towards the same goals and stuff.
It doesn't apparently always work that way. I remember reading about Ukraine and getting internet access, and Elon Musk was personally paying for Starlink access for months and months, and it's not nothing, right? And he said at some point, well, how come I'm privately paying for this? Isn't there some other, either Ukraine or the US or somebody who should step in? And he was, roundly criticized as unpatriotic. And it seems a little strange to me. But circumstances and situations develop their own dynamics. I think what I heard you saying there, Randy, was sometimes when it looks like we're spending money on other countries' defense, that might be at that moment, given the circumstances, the most pragmatic way to achieve the outcome that we can achieve. It's cheaper for us to subsidize helping train those guys and develop them than it would be for us to do anything else. And so don't be too quick to judge what looks like the US being very generous with its spending, because there are smart people trying to figure out pragmatically, well, what's the best way for us to achieve our objectives here? I like that approach. And I like thinking that there are people carefully thinking through. And I want to be comforted to know that it's maybe not all wasteful spending by people who don't care. That's uncharitable. And if you think about it, people who devote themselves to the military and spend their whole careers there are behaving in an extremely patriotic way. They might have their various and different reasons for it, but for sure you can't say you're only looking out for yourself, because people are putting themselves in harm's way. You might never see combat, but that doesn't mean you aren't at risk of it, right? By being in that position, you have said, I'm willing to take a risk for other goals. And therefore, I just want to say the idea that then people are behaving patriotically also with their country's money, that shouldn't come as a gigantic surprise to us. Yeah, we spend a lot of money, but hopefully we're doing it in the best way that we can. So that's a good perspective, and one that I maybe hadn't fully appreciated.
I think I think if this makes any of our listeners, our 5 listeners, feel better, I've heard ambassadors and I've heard military leaders, say, is this the best way to spend taxpayer money? They that's a consideration, and for some of them, not all of them, but some of them have that's like, are we doing the right thing? I mean, people are trusting us with money, and they're trusting with people's lives. So how do we balance the two? What's the best security posture we can have for, do we need to have a nuclear bomb on standby, to defend ourselves in Afghanistan? And if we don't, then maybe we don't need that cost. I mean, that's an exaggeration, of course, but just things like that. I've considered it, and I've heard other people on the State Department and the military side, think out loud about that kind of stuff. So that does happen.
So for me, Randy, the takeaway from today's show is that one way to be wrong less often is to genuinely keep an open mind and accept the idea that your first impression and even your beliefs that you hold might not be accurate. So that idea of saying, I could be wrong about this is not in any way meant to make you feel bad about yourself. It's a way to come to a better understanding of the situation. And just from this discussion, exploring a few topics and talking back and forth, I think for me, it's revealed, yeah, there's stuff you didn't know, and challenging your assumptions is a great way to come to a better understanding of an issue. So thanks for that.
I don't know if we solved any of the world's problems today, but
Just being able to say I gave a little bit of pause and give people a reason to think twice about what they think they know is already solving people's problems, if not the world's problems, all 5 of them.
we'd love to hear what you think. So please comment on the show with your thoughts. We read all of your comments.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for subscribing. See you next time.